committee of the whole for the purposes of a discussion on property tax reform. And if our clerk would please call the roll.
Councilmember Benson,
Councilmember Benson has indicated that he will not be present this afternoon.
Councilmember Durhal III, Councilmember Johnson,
Present.
Councilmember Santiago Ramiro,
Present.
Councilmember Waters,
Present.
Councilmember Whitfield Calloway,
Present.
Councilmember Young II,
Here.
Council President Pro Tem Tate, Council President Sheffield.
Present.
Madam Chair, you do have a quorum.
All right, thank you. There being a quorum present, we are now in session. And if you are joining us virtually at this time, you can please raise your hand for public comment. We will have general public comment after all of our presentations. So please do raise your hand now if you are here or would like to make a public comment. The purpose of the meeting today is to discuss property tax reform. I just want to remind our listening audience, our residents of Detroit, that we do know, of course, of the issue of overassessment and compensation. We are actively still looking at remedies around that issue, but today we really want to focus on the issue of property tax reform. And so the purpose of the meeting is twofold. First, we will discuss whether or not the city continues to continue to overassess, the impact that this has on Detroiters, and how we as elected officials can be responsive to this crisis. And then secondly, we will discuss how to reform property tax assessments. And so we're going to try to stick to a schedule. So we are out of here by 5. And so I am going to adhere to the time slots that were given to me for each speaker. And we will move forward first with our introduction via a video. And if the individual can please be promoted to play the video. And we also have been joined by President Pro Tem Tate. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Madam President. Thank
And before we begin the video, I'm sorry, Member Durhal has joined us and Member Calloway has joined us. Good afternoon. And so the property tax assessment process is very technical. It is important that we begin today's conversation with an understanding of how the city assesses property taxes and how inequitable assessments impact city residents and city government. The Coalition for Property Tax Justice produced a short video giving critical background information. If you want to revisit this video, you can do so on their YouTube and also Facebook pages.
Here's a quick explanation of assessments and overassessments in Detroit. First of all, let's start with the basics. Government wants to tax people fairly. If you have a more expensive house, you should pay more in taxes. The property tax is supposed to work like the sales tax. Everyone pays the same tax rate. The Michigan sales tax rate is 6%, for example. So if you buy something that costs $10, like a pack of light bulbs, you would pay 6 cents in sales taxes. If you buy something that costs $100, like this pair of sneakers, you pay $6 in sales tax. It's fair that you pay more sales tax for a pair of shoes than a light bulb because you're paying the same tax rate for both. Both are taxed at a rate of 6%, and 6% of $100 is more than 6% of $10. This should be true of property taxes too. For example, the Detroit property tax rate is usually around 2.8%. So this means that if your home is worth $10,000, you should pay $280 in property taxes. And if your home is worth $100,000, you should pay $2,800 in property taxes. This is only fair because everyone is paying the same property tax rate. But when the city of Detroit overvalues low-value homes and undervalues high-value homes, people don't pay the same tax rate anymore, and the city on the whole loses money. Let's look at an example. If the city overvalues a low-valued home at $20,000, the owner would end up paying $560 in property taxes, which is $280 more than they should. If the city undervalues a high-valued house at $50,000, the owner would end up paying $1,400 in property taxes, which is $1,400 less than they should. So in these scenarios, the first home is paying an effective tax rate of 5.6%, and the second home is paying an effective tax rate of 1.4%. Since it is critical that the city of Detroit correctly calculates home values so that taxes can be fairly applied, how do they do it? With the sales tax, you know the value of the thing that you're going to be taxed on up front. For example, a pair of sneakers you're interested in buying have the price listed on them. But with property taxes, authorities must estimate how much your home is worth every year. So how do they do this? A home sales price is a strong indicator of its value. The value of your home is basically what someone would pay to buy it on an open market. So in an example where a house sells for $50,000, it's pretty fair to say that the market value of that house is about $50,000. This, of course, is not the case if you have transactions like a property gets sold at auction or you have a quitclaim deed to a family member. But if it sells on the open market, it's pretty safe to say that it's a good proxy for value. Because properties don't sell often, the assessor needs a way to estimate property values even when a property hasn't recently sold. So they estimate a property's market value using a mathematical formula to factor in things like square footage, number of bedrooms and bathrooms, quality of construction, neighborhood condition, and age of the property to determine what a property's market value is worth. This formula is what's used to estimate a property's market value for the purposes of deriving a tax bill. Once city officials have estimated the market value of a house, they take a couple more steps to determine exactly what an individual owner pays. They calculate the assessed value, which by Michigan law is half of the market value of the house, and the taxable value, which is the portion of your property's assessed value that the city of Detroit is legally allowed to tax you on. This is how they come up with a property tax bill. It's the millage rate, or property tax rate, times the taxable value. If the city's formula estimates the value of a house just right, that's great. That property owner pays their fair share in taxes. Here we see a house with a market value of $50K, and the city's formula has also put the estimated market value at $50K, meaning the homeowner pays $1,400 in taxes, and that's the just and fair amount that the homeowner should be paying. If a property is underassessed, the owner is paying less in taxes than is fair based on the value of the home. Here we see a potential example of this, where the actual market value is $50K, but the estimated value is $25K. This means that the homeowner pays less in taxes, and based on the value of the home, they should be paying more. If a property is overassessed, the opposite happens. The owner pays more in taxes than is fair based on the value of the home. So here's an example of this, same actual market value, but here the estimated market value is higher at $75K. That means that the homeowner pays more in taxes than they should based on what their home is actually worth. It's not surprising that over and under assessments happen because assessments are best guesses based on limited information. However, a growing body of evidence shows that over and under assessments don't happen randomly. In cities across America, the data show that if your house is expensive, you're likely to pay less than your fair share in taxes, and if your house is inexpensive, you're likely to be paying more than your fair share. In an ideal situation, a sales ratio might look like this, a flat line, which would tell you that whether you're in the bottom 10% or the top 10% of sales, you are getting market values that were assessed accurately relative to how the home sells. However, in practice, the data looks like this. Across the nation, lower priced homes are assessed at a higher value relative to their actual sales price. Between 2010 and 2016, the city illegally inflated the property tax assessments of the vast majority of Detroit homes and overtaxed Detroiters by $600 million. After the citywide reappraisal, assessments generally fell, but property tax inequity got worse. Before the reappraisal, the lowest valued homes were assessed at roughly 3 times the rate of the highest valued. After the reappraisal, the lowest valued homes were assessed at 4 times the rate of the highest valued. Between 2018 and 2021, the city assessed the highest valued homes at 17.3% of their value, and the lowest valued homes at 88.2% of their value. This means that the city assessed the lowest valued at over 5 times the rate applied to the highest valued homes. Today, City Council convenes to discuss how to make property tax assessments in Detroit more fair. We'll be hearing from residents, experts, and city staff on the subject.
All right, thank you. We will now move to a community member comments by Alexandra Nichols. Ms. Nichols is a lifelong Detroiter. She now works as a teacher within the Detroit Public School System. In 2014, the Wayne County foreclosed on her home for non-payment. Between 2011 and 2014, according to data from the Coalition for Property Tax Justice, the city assessed her home at more than double its value each year. And she is here with us today to share her experience with property tax overassessments and foreclosure. Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us.
Good afternoon, and thank you for having me.
The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I am glad to be here today. Like you've said, my name is Alexandra Nichols Overton, and I just have a legacy home in Detroit. My mom and dad sent all 10 of us kids to college from our home. Um, we always had lively debates in our home. As a child, my dad worked for the city of Detroit in the sanitation department. And he didn't always agree with the politics of the city of Detroit, but he loved Detroit. And so we can all maybe, feel for that conversation, because Detroit isn't what it should be, but seems like it always took the time out to do the best it could for the residents. And so I never thought that I would be in this position with my home that, after my mom passed in 2006 and the home became mine as my name was on the deed, I even taxes before I got ownership of the home, taking my income tax returns and placing it on the home, so my mom didn't have to worry about it as I moved up in my career. But I just going to the I guess the payment office, I got a list of all the taxes I paid since I started paying taxes on the home, and it's over $20,000 from the list that I have. And I just can't understand how this happened to me. You do know I'm in a school, and I'm sorry for the announcement, but I'll try to talk through that. But I'll just say that we have a home that means a lot to me. I thought I'd be having my nieces and nephews in that home with me. I left California in 2014 to come home to my locks changed. I brought a member of the community with me from organization. They saw that my locks had been changed. I couldn't get into my home. My home had been labeled blight. But my home was not blight. They said that a investor had bought up 300 pages or 300 blocks or something of properties, and they needed to get my home released from that, but that never happened. My home never got released from that list. And I talked with Wayne County Treasurer. I talked with the land bank. At the time, the Detroit Land Bank wasn't even formed. They kept telling me, we have to wait. It's with the Michigan Land Bank. Oh no, it's with the Detroit Land Bank. I had no idea where my home was. But when I showed everybody all the documentation, they didn't act on it. And I felt kind of betrayed. I felt horrible. I felt like a failure. I went to California to pursue my career, and now I'm back here in Detroit. And this is not the Detroit that I know. Okay, I just can't get over that fact, that part of the thing. I even tried to get a loan through Bank of America, and I was approved for $70,000 to buy my own home back. I just can't get over that. Not when I presented every entity involved with all my exemption, with this and with that. So I'll say this in closing. I felt alone if it wasn't for the land bank. I called every organization. I talked with the mayor's office finance person day after day after day after day, trying to find out, can they get my home released before it was even auctioned? Nothing. They auctioned my home a day before they said that they were going to auction it. I was in despair. I was living from home to home, renting room to room. Now I'm living in a trailer. I was so alone until I kept calling and calling and calling. And someone said, I know who you need to talk to. You need to talk to the coalition. And I met the coalition. And I tell you, if I hadn't met them and the other Detroiters, because I was out of state, I believe that the city of Detroit, Wayne County Treasurer, the land bank used my parents' death, me being out of state, and this whole mismanagement debacle to take advantage of me. This assessment, I was doubly assessed. I wouldn't be in this problem if I wasn't overly assessed. I was paying the tax bill with no problems up until the time where I got the payment plans. Okay, and then I'm just out of a home in a historic district. I just can't. I had plans on bringing my filmmaker friends here to Detroit to rent rooms with me, to make projects with me. But I'm calling on, I'm reaching out to the city council now. Join us, please. Help us with this mission to make Detroiters whole. I'm a Detroiter through and through. Everywhere I go, still love us, and they should be moving here, and instead, Detroit has to be the Detroit it once was, and make this right by us. And I thank you for your time.
Thank you so much for sharing your testimony today. We truly appreciate you, and I know the coalition is really working with you as well too. And so thank you so much for being a part of our meeting today, Ms. Nichols. We appreciate your time, and thank you for your service as well. Thank you. All right, public comment, general public comment is now cut off, and we will now hear from the City of Detroit's Deputy Chief Financial Officer and Assessor, Mr. Horn. If you can join us at the table, this is your time to present. And just so my colleagues know, we will, after all the presentations, open it up and everyone will have an opportunity to ask questions and or make comments at that time.
Good afternoon, Madam President, members of the Detroit City Council. My name is Alvin Horn, and I am the Deputy CFO and Assessor for the City of Detroit. My purpose here is to listen and to answer any questions that this honorable body might have. I think we're all here for the same purpose, to help Detroiters stay in their homes, to understand what we can do to assist them to defend their rights, to appeal their values, or to understand how those values are assessed, and to make an honest and informed decision on the way going forward. So I said, I am here to answer any questions that you may have or any questions that anyone else may have, but I'm here to listen. So thank you, Madam President.
All right, thank you, Mr. Horn. And if you don't mind, you want to stay seated there and then we can continue.
Yes, ma'am.
We will now bring up Mr. Eric Langowski. He is a data scientist that works with the Coalition for Property Tax Justice. If he can please be promoted.
All right, thank you so much for having me. I'll begin by sharing some slides here. All right, so I'm here to talk a little bit about some of the current state of property tax assessments in Detroit. My name is Eric Langowski. Thank you so much for having me. I'm a data scientist who studied over 2,500 different counties, assessment systems, as well as a lot of focus in Detroit and Cook County, where Chicago is located. And I'm here to talk a little bit about the current state here. So we got our data. The data I'm going to use in this presentation comes from the Detroit Open Data Portal, which is where we get arm's length sales, as well as 2 Freedom of Information Act requests that the Coalition for Property Tax Justice filed with the City of Detroit to get the assessment rolls from 2010 to present. We only included sales in this analysis if the home sold for more than $1,000, if the assessor marked the sale as a valid arm's length transaction between 2 independent parties, and if the sale met the International Association of Assessing Officers arm's length transaction standard, which is basically another way of determining that a sale is valid and should represent the true value of the home. So by using these 3 standards, our study should produce a very conservative estimate of whether the City of Detroit is constitutionally and equitably assessing property taxes. So as you heard from our previous speakers, and you've seen from the work of the coalition, many times the Detroit's tax rates are not just high, they're illegal. But we do have some good news to share that the number of homes that are being unconstitutionally assessed over 50% is falling very dramatically. So this graph here shows, you can see on the left in 2012, over 80% of homes that sold in 2012 were assessed illegally over 50%. And it has fallen pretty much continuously since 2012 until 2021, where the rate is now only 12%, which is a marked improvement. But there's still more work to be done. And let's talk a little bit about how we can start to identify the problem and start to move to a solution. So the Detroit City Council endorsed using some industry standards for measuring assessment equity in a resolution last year. And there's 3 standards, which we'll go through the current performance of the Detroit assessments in 2021. And this resolution basically adopted some of the official industry standards, and it passed the city council and was signed by the mayor. So in 2021, the 3 standards were not met by the assessments, although there was market improvement from past years. So I'll go through them briefly. They're very technical, but it just kind of gives you a sense of there's a range for where the values are in the standard or not in the standard, and we can kind of use that as a basis for our discussion. So the first standard is coefficient of dispersion, and that's just basically a metric of uniformity or kind of general accuracy, where it's looking at how close are the assessments to the actual sales on average across all the sales. So the acceptable range for this metric is below 15, and in 2021, the COD was about 34, which does not meet the standard. So this basically means that we would expect a home worth $100,000 to be assessed between $33,000 and $67,000, because assessments are made at half the market value. And that's compared to if you were meeting the standards, you would expect the home to be assessed between $42,000 and $57,000. So this is a graph of the performance of Detroit assessments on this particular metric. And you can see that it has fallen quite from over 50 to in the 30s since 2017. The next standard is a price-related differential, and that measures vertical equity, which basically is the city taxing homes at the same rate, regardless of how much they're worth. So as you saw from the video at the beginning, if homes are being taxed at the same rate, regardless of what they're worth, you'd have a horizontal line. And if they're not, if the higher valued homes are being taxed at a lower rate, you would have a line that's sloping downward. And the acceptable range for this metric is between 0.98 and 1.03. And in 2021, the metric, the PRD in Detroit was 1.1, which again, it has improved from past years. The final metric is price-related bias. And this is another way of measuring vertical equity, which is whether the city is taxing homes of different values at the same rate. And the acceptable range is between negative 0.05 and positive 0.05. And in 2021, the PRB was negative 0.143. And an interpretation of this is that basically your rate of assessment decreases by 14% every time you double home values. So you'd expect a home that's worth $100,000 to be assessed at 14% lower of a rate than a home that's worth at $50,000. This metric has also shown a lot of improvement, but still not in the official range. So let's talk a little bit about some of the biggest problems remaining in Detroit's assessments. And there are still properties being assessed in violation of the Constitution. You can see that this graph here shows out of all the homes that sold in a given year, what percent were assessed over 50%. And in 2016, it was 53%, and it's fallen to 12% in 2021. So basically 5 out of 6 homes which sell every year in Detroit are assessed in line with the Constitution, but about 1 out of 6 homes are not. But kind of the key thing here is, as the number of homes that are being illegally overassessed decrease dramatically, the ones that are remaining to be overassessed are the lowest valued homes. So in 2016, only about a third of all the homes that were illegally overassessed were the bottom 20%, the lowest valued homes. But in 2021, it's almost 3/4. So basically the problem is diminishing, but the homes that are remaining to be illegally overassessed are the lowest valued homes. So kind of another way to make this point, in the city of Detroit is also underassessing higher valued homes. So in 2021, the most expensive homes were assessed at about 25% of their value, and the least expensive homes were assessed at about 50% of their value. You can see in the graph here, the highest valued homes are assessed at about half the rate of the lowest valued homes, or the lowest valued homes are assessed at about twice the rate of highest valued homes. So if you think back to the video where we had the example of the different tax bills, this kind of shows how people, the city of Detroit is leaving money on the table by undertaxing the highest valued homes, by underassessing them. And then the lowest valued homes are supposed to pay a rate of about 50%, not more than 50%, but around 50%. So you kind of have this, the lowest valued homes paying their fair share, but the underassessment of the highest valued homes. And this is kind of the curve of, you could see across the different deciles of homes which sold in Detroit. The highest valued homes here are on the right, around $200,000 to $100,000, and they're all assessed around a quarter of their value. And then the lowest valued homes are assessed much higher, around 50% of their value. So you can see, as this kind of shows the structural issue, as the value of a home increases, it's much more likely to be underassessed into a greater degree. All right, and then finally, I'm going to close by talking about one specific neighborhood example. So we have two neighborhoods here where we pulled all the sales from 2020 and 2021. The next slide will have a red neighborhood, which is near Southfield and Grand River. For those familiar with assessments, the neighborhood that the assessor uses to make assessments is called ECF, and that's the ECF is there. And then the blue neighborhood is near Plymouth and Greenfield. So here's a plot of all the sales on in those two neighborhoods. So you can see all the red neighborhood is up here, and the red neighborhood is on the top left, and the blue neighborhood is on the bottom right. So near Southfield and Grand River, the average home sells for $164,000, and the city on average assesses these properties at 27% of their value. Near Plymouth and Greenfield, however, the average home sells for $44,000, and the city on average assesses these properties at 40% of their value. So everyone in the Plymouth and Greenfield neighborhood is on average assessed at 50% higher of a rate than the Southfield and Grand River neighborhood. So, all right, that's the end of my remarks. So thank you so much for your time and your attention. We're looking forward to answering all your questions.
All right, thank you so much. And now we will call up Professor Bernadette Atahuane, who is a who is a property law scholar focusing on land stolen from people in the African diaspora. Just make sure your microphone is on. Just touch the bottom. There you go.
Okay, is that better? Okay, Council President and all members of City Council, thank you so much for making this time to hear about the problem of the continued overassessments in Detroit. My name is Professor Bernadette Atahuane. I'm the James E. Jones Chair of Law at the University of Wisconsin Law School. And I'm also a qualified Michigan assessor. And I was a professor. All my work, again, as Council President says, deals with land stolen from people of the African diaspora. My first project looked at land stolen during colonialism and apartheid in South Africa. And I was a professor in Chicago for many years, when right here in my Midwest backyard, this 80% Black city, Detroit, we have land being stolen through illegally inflated property taxes. So I, for the last 4 years, have been living full-time here in Detroit on the city's east side, trying to understand this property tax foreclosure crisis from those I live beside. And I had to humble myself and become a student again. I had to go through a 9-month class to become an assessor, which you can imagine is difficult for a professor to then become a student. But because I didn't want to just, we identified this problem, but I wanted to really figure out, how do we fix it? A lot of professors do studies and they just move on to the next thing, but I couldn't do that because I'm committed to issues in terms of the Black community, whether it's in South Africa, Colombia, or America. So I took the class, and that's what we're here to discuss today, because initially, before I started my research, there was quite a bit of research done by economists at Michigan State and urban planners at the University of Michigan showing property tax inequity. But really, my study was the first to show that these property taxes weren't just inequitable, they were straight up illegal, because I'm a legal scholar, in violation of the Michigan State Constitution, which, as you heard, mandates that no property can be assessed at more than 50% of its market value. Other state laws, to the extent they mention property tax assessments, say things like they must be equal, uniform, right? These are all nebulous standards up to a judge to determine legality. Because Michigan puts a ratio no more than 50% of the property's market value, it means like people like me can come in, run the numbers to determine legality, and that's precisely what we did. And our initial findings using the most conservative estimates were shocking. We found that between 2009 and 2015, in each of those 7 years, anywhere between 55 and 85% of properties the city was assessing in violation of the Michigan State Constitution. And when we broke that data up into 5 quintiles, quintile 1 being the lowest valued homes, quintile 5 being the highest valued homes, we found that in quintile 1 and 2, that 95% or more of the homes were being assessed in violation of the Michigan State Constitution. But when we got to quintile 5, it was only less than 20%, which means that the burden of these illegally inflated property tax assessments in Detroit have been borne by the homeowners in the lowest valued homes, the most vulnerable homeowners. Now, while lots of people who follow Detroit know about the bankruptcy and how the emergency manager, but what people don't know is because of these rampant illegally inflated property tax assessments that I'm describing to you, the state of Michigan also came in and took oversight over the Detroit's assessment division. And Detroit only got full control back at the end of 2017 because at the top of the year, the city completed a parcel by parcel reassessment of every single property in the city. And so at that point, the University of Chicago Center for Municipal Finance redid the main study that everybody uses to determine what's legal, illegal, equitable. Is called an assessment ratio study. That's what you have heard today, assessment ratio studies. And so they redid the assessment ratio study. And what they found is good news, things got better. Right. And I want to just pause there for a second and really give my hat off to Assessor Alvin Horn, because this assessment division was a hot mess. That's my legal term. And under his leadership, it has gotten better. But what we're here to say today is we want to congratulate for all of the progress, but we still have more work to be done. The findings are that the lowest valued homes are still being assessed in violation of the Michigan State Constitution. And so we would like to join hands with the assessor again to figure out how to make sure that those lowest valued homes are no longer being assessed in violation of the Michigan State Constitution. And so the next presentation is really a set of reforms that the coalition has been working on. And the reforms come from number one, over 6 years of research. Number two, the reforms are coming from this class. Now, again, I'm a qualified Michigan assessor now, and so everything I learned in that class. And then number three, it's coming from our property tax appeal project. Many people know that the coalition protests every year for the last 3 years. Homeowners can come to our project and we look at your property taxes to see if you're being overassessed. And if you are, our organization files the appeal for you free of charge. And through that process, we have found innumerable inefficiencies and inadequacies in the property tax appeal process. And so what we're presenting to you today, this next presentation, is really going to be our again, over 5 years of research, over 3 years of practical experience, and the class we took about how we believe the 5 big things that city council can do to fix the problem. There are different things at different levels. So we also have a set of reforms that Governor Whitmer needs to do to fix things at the state level. And we've already been in touch with Governor Whitmer's team. We also have, this is not just a Detroit problem, I want to end by saying. The data says that Blacks and Hispanics in the nation pay on average a 10 to 13% higher property tax rate than whites for the same bundle of goods throughout our nation. That's equivalent to $300 to $400 more per year. This is a national racial justice issue that our nation has not yet begun to deal with. And so together with Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib, we've approached Marcia Fudge of HUD, and we have a 2-pronged solution for the national problem. Again, we've approached Governor Whitmer and her policy team for the changes that need to be done at the Michigan level. But today, we're here before Detroit City Council so you all can implement the reforms that are within your power, because we really need to attack this problem at all levels. Thank you for your time and attention.
All right. Thank you so much, Professor. We appreciate you and your hard work on this issue. We will now call for Ms. Sheehan from the Property Tax Justice Coalition to speak on property tax reforms proposed by the coalition. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much. I'm going to share my slides here. So my name is Marie Sheehan. I am a Justice Catalyst Fellow and lawyer with the Coalition for Property Tax Justice. As Professor Atuahene mentioned, I am also a certified Michigan assessor, and in my role with the coalition, I direct the Property Tax Appeals Project. Through this project, we have filed over 250 appeals, both with the City of Detroit's Assessors Review and the Board of Review. We've also taken over a dozen cases to the State Michigan Tax Tribunal as well. And the focus of all of my legal work and research with the coalition has been on Michigan's property tax laws, rules, and regulations. So all the proposals that we're going to discuss today, as Professor mentioned, stem from this extensive research, and in addition, extensive conversations with community members and homeowners, and also 2 separate rounds of meetings that we've had with all members of Detroit City Council. So for those of you that don't know, the coalition is a collective of 17 Detroit grassroots nonprofits organizations, and these are all of our member organizations. Today, I know we've met with many of you already and talked through all of the reforms that we're proposing, but today we want to focus on the 5 reforms that we think are most critical for City Council to consider. The first is making the assessor's review in the appeals process optional. The second is improving the annual assessment notice that the City of Detroit sends to every Detroit homeowner every year. The third is to improve Board of Review determination letters. The fourth is to release assessment data by February 1st. And the fifth is to allow council to send assessments to the Board of Review for consideration and review of constitutionality. So the first reform is to make the assessor's review optional. Right now, to appeal your property tax assessment, you receive that assessment. Typically, they mail them out at the end of January. You receive it at the beginning of February. And in Detroit, you have to appeal by February 15th to preserve your right to appeal at the Board of Review and at the Michigan Tax Tribunal. This means that Detroiters have 14 days to appeal before losing the right to access any of those additional parts of the appeals process. For the vast majority of Michiganders, every other city in the state except for Grand Rapids, homeowners have until the first Monday in March to file an appeal and preserve their right to access future steps in the appeals process. So they have around 30 days and Detroiters have around 15 or 14, 15 days, depending on when they receive their assessment notice. So we worked on this particular reform, especially closely with Councilmember Johnson's office, Councilmember Santiago Romero's office, President Sheffield, Mr. Donwell, and Mr. Horn also provided a lot of feedback that shaped this reform. We were initially going to propose to remove the assessor's review altogether, but because of capacity concerns raised by those offices, we're proposing to make it an optional process. The second reform that we're proposing today is that the City of Detroit improve assessment notices that it mails to Detroit homeowners every year. And so when we initially proposed this particular reform, Pro Tem Tate asked us to show City Council what this would actually look like in practice. So we've drafted an assessment notice for you all to look at. So all of the reforms I think are very common sense, make the font legible, provide definitions for terms of art and legal jargon, provide an improved FAQ page, things like this. So this notice on the left is the current notice that is mailed to Detroiters every single year. And the notice on the right is the proposed version that the coalition has drafted. And also, we met with Councilmember Young earlier this week, and he really pushed us to look at all of the rules and regulations for adopting new forms at the city level. And so we have gone back and done all of that review as well. So taking it piece by piece, the first part of the notice, the current notice, gives you a little bit of information about your property, but notably only gives you information about one exemption, the principal residence exemption. The updated notice gives homeowners information not only about that exemption, but also the disabled veterans exemption, the income-based HOPE exemption, and the senior solid waste discount. And this is important because it puts on people's minds the minute they receive this notice about different exemptions they might be eligible for to lower their property tax bill and to keep homeownership affordable. this is not new. So in Cook County in Chicago, they already have this sort of exemption information on the notice. On the left is an image from the exemption notice that gets mailed every year in Chicago. So it tells you across the top of the chart all of the different exemptions that exist. And then along the bottom, the history of that property received exemptions for the last 5 years. And then on the tax bill, which is the image on the right, it tells you your pre-exemption bill, and then it shows you how much each exemption deducts from that bill. This is the valuation information on the current notice. As you can see, it tells you the taxable and assessed value, but it doesn't tell you the market value that the assessor imputes from those two values. It also doesn't define any of these terms. So in this updated section, we've added a row for the assessor to include the market value, which is so important for homeowners that don't know about the 50% ratio. We've also included a line which we took from the Ann Arbor assessment, which says, why did the city of Detroit adjust my 2023 property value? So that homeowners know why their assessment went up or down from year to year. I think most notably, and the piece of this notice that needed by and far the most work, was this appeal instruction portion. Many of the clients that we worked with through the property tax appeals project repeatedly complained that this section was confusing, dense, hard to read, tiny print. So we updated it. And I believe that Councilmember Santiago Romero should have a sample that you all can view, but what this form is a form that would go in addition to the assessment notice in the same envelope. So it's a form you could actually fill out as like the minute you get your assessment notice, and all of the like property specific information would be pre-written or pre-printed by the assessment division. And then all the homeowner would need to do is check the boxes explaining why they're complaining about a particular assessment, and they can attach photos on the back or on the back of the form, like write more about the basis for their appeal. We've also updated the FAQ page. So this is what the FAQ page on the City of Detroit looks like right now. There's no, I think it's under review, which is why the questions aren't there, but it's usually just a long list of questions. None of those questions deal with how to navigate the appeals process, and none of those questions deal with how to understand how your assessment is actually calculated. So we've expanded the number of questions that are on this page. We've created a couple of different mock-ups, which I believe we've shared with all the council members' offices, and really put a focus on describing how property taxes and values are computed and how to navigate the appeals process. The third reform is to improve the Board of Review determination letters. So right now, this is what a determination letter looks like. The entire letter is generic, except for the numbers that appear in the before appeal and after appeal rows or columns. There's no property specific information, reason for determination, or finding of fact like you would have in front of any other administrative tribunal or court. And both kind of Councilmember Tate and Councilmember Callaway pushed us in the direction of adding more information, Pro Tem Tate pushed us in the direction of adding more information to this notice, because it creates a record of the appeal. So when the tax tribunal comes back and looks at the decision of the Board of Review, they know why the Board of Review made a particular calculation or finding. The next reform is to release all assessment data by February 1st. And this deadline is really important. This is a list of the data we want released by February 1st of every single year. And we spoke with Mr. Horn about this, and he was strongly supportive of this particular reform. But the reason for the February 1st deadline is that, a lot of this data already gets released now, but we don't get it in time to use it for the appeals process. So as Professor Atuahene mentioned, we've taken 250 cases over 3 years through the appeals process, and not once has the information been posted in time on the website for us to use it for the assessor's review for that February 15th deadline. So it's really important that this data gets online by that February 1st deadline, so homeowners have a meaningful chance to review it before the first appeal deadline. And definitely want to thank Councilmember Waters for her contribution here. She's been constantly pushing us in the conversations we've had with her to think about how to increase transparency and access to information in the appeals process. The next and final reform is to allow City Council to intervene to stop overassessments. So this is sort of a two-piece reform. The first piece is to create an independent review board that sits in an advisory capacity to City Council. It's a 3-member board, and each member is appointed by a majority of vote of council. The board is made up of academics who have quantitative background in property tax experience. And the responsibilities of the board are to conduct a sales ratio study every year. The reason that this study is so important is because it's the only study that can tell you 2 things. The first is whether assessments are legal, meaning within that 50% limit. And the second is whether they're equitable, which is what Eric touched on earlier, which is, are properties of different values being assessed at the same effective rate and taxed at the same effective rate. The part of this reform that allows council intervention is right now, when someone thinks their assessment's inequitable, that assessment can be reviewed by the Board of Review in 2 distinct ways. The first is if the homeowner files a protest of their tax assessment to the Board of Review. The second mechanism for the board to take up a particular assessment is just on its own motion. That's permitted both by state law and city ordinance currently. Under the proposed process, there would be a third mechanism for the board to take up a particular assessment for review. So the first 2 still exist. And then the third is that City Council can send a class of cases, I should say, to the Board of Review for evaluation of constitutionality. So if, for example, the Board of Review's sales ratio study, or excuse me, the independent board sales ratio study finds all properties worth $11,000 and less that are owner occupied are being assessed above the 50% limit. The City Council could say, okay, the Board of Review now needs to review all of those assessments individually to determine whether or not they're accurate. And the importance of the review at this stage is it prevents people from being overassessed and then later having to talk about having that conversation about compensation. So it ensures people are taxed accurately in the first instance. And the General Property Tax Act allows the City of Detroit to create unique appeal procedures like this one. Section 107 of the Act says that the requirements of the Act relating to the procedures for the collection of taxes are applicable to cities and villages if they are not inconsistent with the charters or ordinance enacted pursuant to charter. So the City of Detroit relied on this provision in creating a mandatory assessor's review. The state act does not contemplate an assessor's review, and it does not allow a mandatory assessor's review. But because of this provision, the City of Detroit enacted such a review, which is the same reason that the City Council would be able to intervene and enact this amendment to the appeals process as well. And this reform really comes from conversations with President Sheffield, who has constantly pushed us to think about how to solve the problem in the first instance. So that is the end of my presentation, and I look forward to answering your questions later. Thank you.
Mr. Horn, it looks like you're ready to respond. All right, thank you so much. At this time, we can allow for a discussion from all of my colleagues. I see Mr. Downwell, who is here as well. Mr. Downwell, if you want to join us at the table as well, just in case council members has questions for you as well. And we can open it up for questions. Before I do so, did you want to make a comment, Mr. Horn, or respond at all?
Not so much respond, Madam President. Thank you. First of all, I will agree with the good professor. There is much work left to be done. I appreciate the comments over the work that has been done. All congratulations to staff in the assessor's office and to this honorable body who have been quite supportive of the reforms and providing the resources that the assessor's office needs, along with the CFO and the mayor himself, who is the only mayor that I know of who stands in front of the city every January and talks about assessments. So there is much to be done. Much has been accomplished. But I would point out a couple of things that the coalition said. They represent that they've handled 250 appeals over a 3-year period. I would ask the members to put that in perspective. There are 409,000 plus parcels in the city of Detroit. There are 225,000 houses. 250 appeals over a 3-year period is not a problem. Dozens upon dozens of appeals that go to the Michigan Tax Tribunal over a 3-year period is not a problem. There is no systemic problem with assessments in Detroit, but I won't lie to you and say that every single house in this city is properly assessed. It's statistically impossible, but that's why we have an appeals period. And I take issue with the coalition's belief that we have the shortest appeal period in the state. We have the longest appeal period in the state. From February 1st through February 22nd is the assessor's review. Yes, city ordinance requires residential property owners in the city to go to the assessor's review. But that's no different than state law that requires everyone to go to the March board review before they can appeal to the Michigan Tax Tribunal. I would also point out that it was suggested that because property owners in other cities, because of the March board review, have almost a month to appeal. That's not entirely true. I've spoken to the assessors in the surrounding areas. I've spoken to the assessor in Grand Rapids. Yes, every March board review opens the first Tuesday in March and ends the last Thursday in March. Detroit is the only city in the state that starts holding hearings as soon as it opens. No other city hears hearings for the entire month of March, a few days. Grand Rapids had 203 appeals last year. Detroit had close to 3,000. It's not an apple to apple comparison to say, to point to another city and say, that's what they do. Why don't you do this? The assessor's review is an opportunity, and you'll hear this from members of the board review and others. It is an opportunity, an informal opportunity for the assessor's office to catch a mistake, make a correction, or explain the process to a taxpayer before a very formal hearing starts at the March board review. We fix a lot of stuff at the assessor's review. The assessor's review, and I've said this to the CFO, it's as much for the assessor's office as it is for property owners in the city of Detroit. 400,000 plus parcels, we'll never catch everything unless people tell us there's a problem. That's what the assessor's review does. That's how it benefits taxpayers, because it allows the assessor's office to very informally correct a problem. Determine, hey, if we have 10 people in the same block or same neighborhood telling us the same thing, send 5 appraisers over that block and see that we do something wrong. Review the cells over there and fix it before it becomes an issue. That we can do without forcing people to go into a formal hearing. The March board review is a very formal process. Property owners are required to present evidence to support their belief that the assessment is wrong. Assessor's review is very informal. Call us up and say, hey, I don't think you got it wrong. Fine, we'll talk to you. We'll take a look out there. We'll go out there and take a look at what's going on in the neighborhood. March board review doesn't work like that. It's very formal. It's organized under state law. So that's basically, that's what caught my attention during the presentation. But like I said, I think I have the utmost respect for the coalition, actually. I know that doesn't come across that way sometimes, but I think we're all striving to find ways to assist property owners to make sure that Detroiters have all the information they have so they can protect their rights. I'm all for that, and I'll do everything I can working with this council to do that. Thank you, Madam President.
Thank you so much, Mr. Horn. And Mr. Downwell, I know you just joined us at the table. Would you like to say anything before we move to questions from my colleagues?
Thank you, Council President. I just want to quickly say that, I think this is a great opportunity to, again, advance the city, advance the process, and move some things forward. I have been very familiar in working with the coalition over a number of years, and we've made some changes in other parts of the process. I think that it's important that we take the time to listen to what they have to say, because I think some of the things they have are some pretty good ideas. We just need to figure out how they will work in the process as it is now.
All right, thank you. So we'll now move to questions, comments from my colleagues. Before we do so, I just want to ask you, Mr. Horn, has the city of Detroit ever completed an assessment ratio study? And if not, why not? If not, what is the reason behind that? I know a lot of the information that I've read, I mean, all of the data comes from these assessment ratio studies. And if you guys are refuting what the University of Chicago and others are stating, it seems to me that the city should conduct its own assessment ratio study to have that data and that evidence to provide. So if you can speak to that, please.
Thank you, Madam President. I would point out that Detroit is not an island to itself. There is oversight of the assessor's office at the county level and at the state level. Anyone who has evidence that this city continues to overassess property systematically should take that evidence to the Michigan State Tax Commission, and they should take it to the Wayne County Equalization Director. Both of those agencies have the authority under state law to force the City of Detroit assessor to comply with state law. The fact that we keep hearing overassessment, and yet no evidence has been presented to the agencies that have oversight over over the assessor's office, who can order the assessor to comply with state law, that hasn't happened yet. And I think that's quite telling. Madam President, get back to your question. We are compliant with every aspect of Michigan law. Those aren't required under Michigan law. Quite simply, it's not required under Michigan law. We produce a sales study based on Michigan law. It's on the city's website. It is turned over to county equalization every year. The county verifies that the city of Detroit is compliant with Michigan law.
All right, so I guess even if the law can be flawed, because essentially what we're seeing in the reports is that we are still assessing. And I based on my reading of it, I'm an independent council member. I have a voice and I can express that I do believe the evidence does show that those lowest value homes are being overassessed. Yes, you may be abiding by state law. You may be abiding by what the state tax commission lays forth, but it still seems to me that it is happening. So I'm not sure why the city would not want to undergo an assessment ratio study just to refute what universities from all over are indicating is true. And I know that a larger conversation is that state law probably needs to be changed, which I sponsored a resolution years ago to that effect, but I just don't understand why you would be against conducting, I know it's not required or mandatory, but why we would not want to undergo such a study to refute whatever other institutions or the data is suggesting.
If I may respond, Madam
Yes.
President. I find it bewildering that people who believe that the city is continuing to overassess properties don't take that evidence to the Michigan State Tax Commission, or don't take that evidence to the County Equalization Director. Once again, both those agencies can force this office to comply with state law. If there is evidence that we are in violation of Michigan law, then they have an obligation to the property owners and to this body, since they continue to bring up overassessed, illegally overassessing, unconstitutionally overassessing, then take it to the people who can make this office comply with the state law, And that hasn't happened yet. And I think that's telling.
Professor?
Yeah, if you remember, Council President, when she was pro tem, organized exactly the meeting you're talking about, and you attended.
Yeah.
With the State Tax Commission was in the room, the Wayne County Equalization was in the room, you were in the room, and Council, back then, pro tem's team was in the room. Are you forgetting about that meeting where we presented Chris Barrett, the University of Chicago flew all the way down to Detroit to present the data at that meeting?
I remember they rejected the evidence.
So obviously, you know, Council President was there. So what happened at that meeting is we presented the data to show the continued overassessments.
Mm-hmm.
And what the response of the State Tax Commission was, well, as long as he's, they said, their response was, as long as he's following the different procedures, they felt, these bureaucrats at the State Tax Commission felt like there was nothing they can do as long as he's following the procedures. Although there was evidence that the numbers were in contravention of the Michigan State Constitution. So that's what the bureaucrats from the STC and the Wayne County Equalization told us all when we were all sitting there at that meeting. But I want to really I want you all to listen to what I hear. Again, I have the utmost respect for Alvin Horn, but what I hear him saying is, well, why hasn't the state and the county come to take over Detroit's assessment? Detroit should get in front of the thing before the county equalization or the state has to come and intervene in Detroit's calculations and business, right? It should be the first priority of Detroit's assessment division, if they do believe they are not illegally assessing properties, to produce their own assessment ratio study. We have 3 different assessment ratio studies from 3 different universities that show the overassessments are continuing. Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib has now sent 3 different letters to Mayor Duggan, CCing Alvin Horn, which Mr. Horn has responded to 2 of the 3 already. And not what she keeps asking him to produce an assessment ratio study, and they are not producing this assessment ratio study. So again, I'm an academic, so all of this politicking is beyond me, and it actually makes me ill. But at the end of the day, if you believe that these assessments are not illegal, produce the data. That's all I want to see and hear is data. I don't want to hear opinions. We have our data. We brought our data to the table at that meeting that we're talking about. They have not yet brought their data to the table. And so to me, that's the end of the story. This has to be a conversation about data. Thank you,
Mr. Horn,
Council
and
President.
I do not want this to get into a back and forth. I will allow you to respond, then we can go to questions and comments from council members, but I think it's a healthy conversation to have. I mean, I don't want to get back and forth, but I think it's important for the residents to hear both sides. There is evidence, there's data from universities, peer-reviewed reports that I saw, and I mean, it's out there, and I think that each side should have an opportunity to present. I don't want to go back and forth too much, but I do think it's important to educate and allow the residents to hear both sides, and they can make a decision as well as to what side they believe or want to look into further. Mr. Horn, and then we'll go back to questions and comments from my colleagues.
I think it's easy to dismiss people as bureaucrats when they didn't tell you what you wanted to hear. Not a single person who values property, not a single person who signs the assessment role has signed off on Professor Berry's study. The Lincoln Land Institute, actually in a review of it, said he used regression models, which were known to have bias in them, and he found what he was looking for. So no, it's not as clear cut as some people would suggest. His study is the ultimate and final say in this. I have a lot of respect for the good professor, and I have a lot of respect for the coalition. I think they brought a lot of good ideas to the table. And I think there are a lot of things we can do to improve the process, to make it more transparent. But I also think we have to be clear on what's really happening. It's easy to say there's an overassessment issue. Prove it. My proof is the city's assessment role. It's out there for everyone to see. My proof is every sale that we look at to compute values for the city is on the city's website. Every single one of those sales, whether we used it or not, they're marked or not marked. My proof are our ECF studies. They're out there on the city's website for everyone to look at. My proof is the state mandated sales review and sales analysis, which is out there on the city's website, which has been reviewed by county equalization and accepted. So that's my proof. Every bit of data that we use to compute the values for every single property in this city is there for everyone to see on the city's website. And I stand behind it. I stand behind everything we put on the website, and I stand behind the work of our office. Thank you, Madam President.
All right, thank you so much, Mr. Horn. All right, we will open it up for comments or questions from any of my colleagues at this time. Yes, Member Young.
Thank you, Madam President. I just wanted to thank you so much. Wonderful presentation. And I hope I can get the copy or sent to me of the video presentation as well as the presentation that was there earlier. It really broke it down. I really appreciate that. It's not on. Okay. I hope I can get the copy. Sorry, I get the conversation, get the copy of thank you of the video presentation as well as the presentation of the PowerPoint. I really appreciate that. I just wanted to ask you, and we talked about this earlier, so I just kind of ask you just a variation, same question again. Everything that we do usually here is attached to an ordinance, and everything the state does is attached to a state statute. And when you were talking about reforming and simplifying that process, the tax roll, tax bill, excuse me. My question is this something that the city is capable of doing on its own, or is this something that we would have to do after the state does that, in your opinion? Because
I support simplifying that. I support what you're trying to do. I think it's a good thing. What I don't want to do, I want to be careful of, is when I say something, I say I support something, I want it to actually be with that intention that this will pass. I don't want to sell my constituents a bill of goods, say we're going to pass this, and the state comes in and says this is illegal and you can't do that. So that's my first question. And then my second question is when you're talking about using being able to properties that that the city council receives knowledge that these properties are overassessed, and so as a result they can send them back through the to review board of review process, send them back to the board of review. Usually when you see, because we have the right to refusal, so we can do that now, the city, but usually when you have those properties and the county, buys those properties from the city, borrows from the bank to be able to do that, we receive money from the county for those foreclosures. Is that going to impact the plan of adjustment with the bankruptcy that revenue is on? Will that impact the plan of adjustment and the bankruptcy with the revenue that we have anticipated coming in from to the city?
Councilmember Young, thank you so much for those two questions. To address your first one, so as a law professor, what legality is my strong suit. So we have done our homework, and making those changes to the notice is absolutely within the confines of the law. What happens now is the State Tax Commission issues a sample notice that but they say they make it very clear in the law, in the General Property Tax Act, that localities are free to veer from that. Right? It is just a sample. And especially in a place like Detroit, the largest city in Michigan, we have no business following that particular notice. We have to come up with something unique that's really unique to the population here in Detroit. So I can guarantee you that's absolutely legal. And Monday, we're going to give you the updated memo so you can, with the citation, so you can actually see that for yourself.
Please.
As to your second question, so we don't even, so this is totally separate from the right of first refusal. We're trying to get in front of this monster.
Okay.
We don't even want to get to the city using its right of first refusal. We want to stop these property tax assessments before it becomes a bill, right? So what we're doing now is, once, the assessor issues the assessments, right? We want to make the assessor's review optional. And then so people can go to the assessor's review, they see fit, but they can go like every other homeowner in Michigan, the first Monday in March, they can come to the March Board of Review. And then the point is, at the March Board of Review, if these experts, you all will, again, we have a group of experts lined up, academics who are willing to sit on this 3-person board for free to do these studies for city council for absolutely free. And if you look at those studies and you all determine, oh my goodness, the evidence seems very strong that homes worth $15,000 and under are systematically being overassessed. This reform allows you to jump in front of the beast, send those homes to the March Board of Review for them to double check so that it gets fixed before the property tax bill is even issued.
Okay. So this is before the
way before. We're trying to get Council President really challenge us. How do we fix the problem? And so this is what, again, our research shows is a way to get all the way in front of it to really fix the problem, because really the coalition is interested in compensation. And our position is you can't think about compensation until you suture the wound. There are still illegal assessments happening in Detroit. We've got to suture the wound. And then after we suture the wound, we can really start dealing with compensation. And this is the set of reforms we believe are going to suture the wound.
Okay, so it's not going to be a situation where you had someone who we find that these properties were overassessed, and they're already gone through the foreclosure process. We send those properties back. You're saying this is going to happen.
You got it. We're getting it even before we're going to correct it before they even get their tax bill.
That's what I was going to say. This is my final question. My final question is, and this may not raise a whole lot of money. This might be more of a national problem, but being the blackest city in America, on average, even when you take into account, neighborhood crimes and things of that nature, a black house is underappraised by $48,000 nationally. So it's about $150 billion collectively taken out of the Black community as a country. Has there been an analysis in terms of underappraisal based on race at all in the city of Detroit? Because we have a lot of, especially in the houses that are higher value that we're saying to be underassessed, we have a lot more diversity. now in a lot of these communities. And so you can very well have a situation where, yeah, you have under assessment, but these properties are being under appraised as well. So how much money are we losing from the racial standpoint? Has there been any discussion or analysis to that or inclusion of that in these studies at all?
Yes, Councilmember Young, again, thank you for that question. You put your finger on something so important, and it's a problem we call the double bind.
Okay.
All right. So what you find is when it comes, and many of you have seen these articles in the New York Times and the Washington Post about there's an article about the professor at Johns Hopkins who tried to sell his house and then he removed everything Black from it. And then it comes in like $300,000 more. And we hear story after story about that. And so Blacks and Latinos in America, again, are experiencing the double bind, meaning when it comes to appraising our house for sale, the houses are being undervalued. But when it comes to appraising of our houses for property taxation, they're being overvalued, right? And so it's two sides of the different coin, and we call that the double bind. Now, there's been some convincing data. I can send you a national study on the appraisal issue, but there has not been anything to my knowledge right now, and I follow this pretty closely, about Detroit specific on the appraisal issue, but there has been something that I will have my team send you tomorrow about the national study about this appraisal issue. But you have put your finger on the double bind, and that's what Black and brown people in America are dealing with. And it's contributing to the racial wealth gap.
Yeah, go right ahead. Floor is
No,
yours.
thank you. I also wanted to ask the law department, in terms of the first question I asked, particularly about the issue of, is this something that legally that we could be able to do? Has there been a, do you have any sort of analysis or report or anything that's been asked about this at all? Or opinions on, is this something we legally could do?
Through Madam President, can you ask that in a more specific way?
Sure.
For me? Thank you.
So the way in which we're talking about the property tax form now, we're talking about changing the property tax form to simplifying it. And when they're talking about simplifying it, they're talking about adding all the tax exemptions you could qualify for. They actually have language that says you have to break it down to where you can understand it on a third grade reading level. And I just want to know, if we make those type of changes to this document, is that something that's going to run against state law? Is that something where we're going to be violating state law when we do this? Is this legal for us? Do we have an authority as a city to be able to act on this unilaterally? Or do we have to wait for the state to act first before we can implement these changes?
So through Madam President, so it sounds like you're saying you want to make it more accessible.
Well, what I'm saying is, I just want to know if this is something that we legally could be able to do. You know, usually these documents are tied to either ordinance or statutes. You know, when you get your tax bill, it says, state tax commission on it. It talks about the statute underneath it. And so if this is a public, if I'm doing this, am I violating a public act by changing this document? That's what I'm saying. Do we need state permission to engage in these changes, or do we have the power as a municipality, as a home rule municipality, to be able to act on this without state approval?
So before the law department responds, Member Young, we have not formally submitted the changes to the law department.
Oh, I'm
to
sorry.
opine on it yet.
I'm sorry.
So
I'm sorry.
once the actual ordinance is introduced and the proposed changes, I'm sure the law department will have an official written opinion on the legality of the ordinance. And then, as always, if it's not legal in their opinion, they will not approve it as to form. And so that will be forthcoming. But yes.
Just to help. Can I actually respond to him real
Yes,
quick?
go right ahead, law department.
Yeah. So what I would suggest is whatever form you're thinking about changing, maybe do a markup on what you would like to see.
Okay.
And then submit that. But I will, once you guys, as Madam President just indicated, once you submit something formally, we will respond to it.
Apologize. Sorry about that.
Madam President, if I may,
Yes.
I
and then
believe we
followed
do.
by Professor. Go right ahead.
In response to the member's question, I believe we do. I believe we can make some modifications to assessment notes as long as we keep the basic form of the template in place. And even in those instances where we can't change it, we do have the right to add things to that mailing. So even if we can't put everything on the notice itself, we can certainly add things to that notice and send them out as one. So I think there's a lot of agreement that we can do things to better inform taxpayers when we send out the assessment notice. So I just want to add that, Madam President.
Thank you so much, Mr. Horn.
Thank you.
Mr. Don will follow.
And-
I'm sorry.
I just wanted to add super quick, just to help the law department along. It's section 211.24C that allows us to make these changes to the assessment notice.
Thank you. Mr. Don
Yep, and just real quickly, on city council sending parcels to the Board of Review, you actually have that right now. This would simply codify it in the ordinance and notifying everyone that you have that right and ability. Every year, I get calls from council members or members of your staff relative to individuals who are trying to get, through the assessment process. Or whether it's done in community meetings, what have you. Again, so it's already available to you now. It's just that, again, but I think it's a good idea to codify it in the ordinance so that it is clear in terms of creating a policy and structure to the process.
Great. All right, thank you. Any additional questions or comments? Yes, Member Waters?
Okay. All right. Thank you, Madam President. Matter probably a little bit more specific to the Board of Review. And I have a few questions. Has any of the changes mentioned in the proposal ever been discussed before? That's the first question.
Through Council President to Member Waters, yes. So perfect example, changes to the assessment notice. We've looked at years ago, changes to the assessment notice with the Office of the Assessor. The challenge was cost. So I just want you to think about when we talk about everything that we're discussing in this ordinance, there is going to be a cost to it. And so whatever that cost is going to be, you need to understand what it's going to be probably prior to making the decision. So you understand what you're getting into. But here's the reality. So I want to go back one quick second. Willie Don will administer it to the Board of Review. I never said that in the beginning, but
Everyone knows. No.
so the changes to the assessment notice, I think, are important, but we can't allow for individualizing classes of properties. When you change that assessment notice, you're going to have to make sure that whatever notifications that is done across all classes of properties. So just like you're notifying people about PREs and exemptions, you're going to have to notify commercial and industrial individuals relative to whether or not they have an IFT. You have to make sure that you notify homeowners that have NEZs as relates to the expiration date. You're not going to have the ability to limit what that's going to be. In addition to that, I'm sure Mr. Horn can speak on this a little bit more if he wants to, but you're going to have to probably think about what it's going to take in the Office of the Assessor to actually have that process to happen. So you're talking about during the time when you're closing the December board and opening up the March board. And so to actually be able to pull this data, you're going to need particular staff to do that. So again, I would probably have to defer to him to speak on it, but I'm just going to simply say that you would either need additional staff or there's going to be overtime involved. And again, I think it's a really good idea, again, to have a better assessment notice. I just want to give you the full picture of what it is that you're addressing. And then as it relates to the notice itself, I'm going to suggest that it is taken to the State Tax Commission in terms of the change of the notice for approval. One of the forms that I'm so proud of is the multi-parcel appeal form. I created it and it was taken to the State Tax Commission as it was, and it was approved as it was by the State Tax Commission. So we have the ability to do certain things and to make certain changes. That's not the problem. I would just want you to think about as we make these changes, either what the cost is going to be or the overall effects of the changes, because what we need to happen is to make sure that it is properly affecting the community. As it relates to, the assessor review process, I'm just going to say this real quickly. The March Board Review is 17, and for 2023, the March Board Review is going to be 17 days, March the 8th through the 26th. It's going to close on the 26th because it's going to take a week to balance the assessment roll. and prepare that assessment roll to be signed by the board by the first Monday in April. The assessor review kind of expands on that. It gives the opportunity or more days starting in February. So you're expanding it in reverse by giving more days. So now you actually have pretty much a month and a half versus just 17 days. And so I just want to give you again some real concept to what that is. And I'm gonna be honest, in the past and from time to time, even now, I have challenges in accepting the assessor's review because of what it does and doesn't do. But here's again the reality of what it does do. There will be this year, coming up next year, probably 10,000 people that will file during the assessor's review. 6,000 of those items is probably going to be clerical items that's going to get cleaned up at the assessor's review. If it's an appeal that is filed to the March board, we don't have the ability to treat it as a clerical item. It's an appeal, so it has to be heard. We can't say, hey, assessor, they just need to file this form, or they just need to do a PRE or PTA, whatever they need to do. We have to actually do a hearing and go and take them through the process. So the assessor review serves the purpose, because again, some days, some years, I struggle with it, but it simply serves the purpose. So I'm gonna.
All right, Madam President, I have just a couple more. You did bring up cost. So what do you think the current cost of the Board of Review is, including exemptions? Just, an approximate number if you don't know exactly.
So just the Board of Review itself, exemptions, so just the HOPE exemptions example. HOPE exemptions for 2021 was probably about $12 million is what we excused in property taxes. The cost of the Board of Review itself is probably another $2 million when you look at the salaries for the board, staffing, and the space that we're in and so forth. So the reality is $12 million when people are saying that there's no abatements for homeowners, I think is a pretty substantial.
Okay, so who ultimately has the final say in what you do?
I'm saying this with the most amount of respect to this body as possible through the chair, State Tax Commission. We have to act in accordance with the State Tax Commission. If we don't act in accordance with the State Tax Commission, they simply come in, seize the role in terms of whatever it is that we're doing, and they hand it over to the county equalization director and then send the city a bill. Perfect. Just real quickly, a number on the bill. And this has happened in the past. Previously, it was $12 a parcel. City of Detroit is over 400,000 parcels. So estimate $5,184,000 is what it would cost the city if the Board of Review did something that was in conflict. And I'm going to give you a quick brief history on how I got here. In the end of 2007 is when the State Tax Commission was planning to come in and take the assessment roll because of some things the Board of Review may have been doing at that time. There was a second time during the bankruptcy time period where the then Chief Assessor, Linda Beatty, was going to the State Tax Commission. So the confidence that the STC has in my abilities, Mr. Horn abilities, has been able to help kind of create a sense of, hey, these guys have it under control down there. So, we're gonna just make sure we're paying attention to what they're doing, but they've got it under control.
All right, thank you. So just one more, Madam President, if that's okay. What is the current status of the Board of Review, and do you think certification is important?
And this was kind of mentioned earlier. The law is kind of strange there. It's not written in the state law, but we want to do it locally. I think certification is important. I don't think MCO is really necessary, but I think that at least in MCAT, because it gives a board member the basis of understanding the assessing process. But let's not forget what the state statute calls for. It simply calls for electors of a local community, and 2/3 of them being property owners. So you want to continue to provide the opportunity for anybody who's from the community to be able to serve, and then let them get the training afterwards. Let the city pay for the training afterwards to help them get the certification and give them time to get that certification. I think that is one of the best processes that we can do, because we can take a person who has actually very little to no knowledge and actually build the framework for a person to become knowledgeable and ultimately, if they choose, an expert in property taxation.
Thank you, Madam President. Thank you, Mr. Dunmore.
Thank you.
Thank you, Member Waters. Any additional comments or questions? You sure? Was it Member Johnson?
Thank you, Madam President. So I want to go back to where one individual doing the presentation talked about the improvements that we've seen for the lower valued properties in the city. And Mr. Horn, you indicated that there has been some progress made in the assessor's office as well. Is there anything in particular that you can point to that led to the lower property, the lower valued properties being assessed more in line with the, not going over the state statute of the 50%?
Thank you, through the chair. Thank you for the question, ma'am. One of the things I'm most proud of in my tenure as the assessor for the city of Detroit is the emphasis on training for staff. Our staff is certified. Every clerk is offered the opportunity to get certification. Our managers and supervisors are among the best in the city, the best in the state at what they do. We have taken, and that's done with the support of this honorable body, who's provided every dime we've ever asked for training, the support of the CFO, who's made it clear that whatever resources you need, ask for when you'll get them, and a mayor who's made it quite clear that you're going to get this right, and you need to get this right because this will never happen again. It's the training and the leadership in the assessor's office over the last 6 years that's done that. We've changed the culture. Prior to 2014, there was an Auditor General's report in 2011, and they quoted some of the appraisers in their office. They felt their job was to defend the values no matter what. And we've had to remind people, no, that's not your job. Your job is to get the value right. And that means changing the number, then change the number. You are paid to make sure that every property in this city is valued according to at 50% of market value. That's it. You don't stay on your horse if the number is wrong. Change it. And that message has reverberated through the assessor's office. Staff understands their job is to make sure that these values are correct. That's been the biggest change. There's been a sea change in the office over the last 10 years. So I thank you for the question. It's the training and it's the leadership and support of the elected officials of the city that have led to these improvements.
Thank you. And so when you look at the increase in property values throughout the city of Detroit, and I can imagine it would be difficult to determine the value of a property if you are in an area where you have not seen property sales. How do you determine the market value to accurately determine the assessed value?
Through the chair, thank you for the question again, ma'am. It is difficult in a place like Detroit to value property. We have some of the finest housing stock in the state. We also have the average age of a house in Detroit is 89 years old. There was an audit report by Style earlier this year that compared Detroit's residential stock to the surrounding communities. The average construction date in surrounding communities was sometime in the 70s and 80s. The average construction date in Detroit was the 20s and 30s. So it makes it difficult. It goes back to the training of the staff. It goes back to understanding the condition of the property, the age of the property, the condition of the neighborhood. We had over 55,000 transfers of all types, sales, quitclaim deeds, land contracts. Most of them can't be used because they don't meet the definition of current market value, but they all serve a purpose. We look at every single one of them because they tell a story. They tell us what's happening in a particular neighborhood. So even though you have all those sales and you can't use all of them per se to look at value, they tell you what's happening in that neighborhood and you need to understand that. I wish I could tell the members of this body that's an exact science that 2 + 2 is always going to come out to 4. It's not. Linda Beatty's name came up earlier. She was my predecessor as the chief assessor for the city of Detroit. And one of the best words of wisdom she ever gave me is that it's an art, not a science. There's a lot of science behind it, but there's an art to valuation. You need to know the neighborhoods. That's why we still send people to neighborhoods. You need to understand what's happening in the community. That's why we still, even though we have a very high-tech desktop appraisal apparatus, when we look that we use for most of the properties, we keep the number of appraisers that we keep because we know in an older urban setting like Detroit, you still need to put your eyes on the house. So we look at everything we get our hands on. We look at every sale we can possibly get our hands on. And when in doubt, we start looking at building permits, we start looking at demolitions, we look at whatever data we can that tells us what's going on in the particular neighborhood to build our valuation model. It's not an exact science, but I think our staff has gotten pretty good at it. And it kind of relates to the earlier question. Staff is trained better, they have better leadership, they have more experience in what they're doing, and they understand what the law calls for them to do.
And so lastly, so you also take into consideration the environment around the individual property. So you're looking at the condition, not only of that particular house, but the entire area.
To the president, yes, ma'am. Sometimes it gets lost in the argument. You look at sales, you look at the cost manual. That's part of the equation. The other part of the equation is the condition, the surrounding conditions of that house. You can have a house that you might think is worth $100,000, but if you're in a neighborhood where half of it's been burnt down and you're living right next to a crack house and 2 shells across the street, you'll never sell for that much. So you have to look at the condition of the neighborhood before you determine value. So that is one more reason why we keep the staff on site that we do, because those are things you can't get from a sales or from a deed or from a PTA. You have to go look at that neighborhood.
Thank you. The only other thing I'd just like to ask if you can point my team in the direction of the information that you said that is available to the public that verifies or justifies your numbers. I would love for you to do that. You don't have to do that now, but if you can just point me in the direction so I can take a look at the data that you have that you utilize to assess.
Thank you. Through the president, I'd be happy to, ma'am. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam President.
Thank you, Member Johnson. Member Gabriela Santiago Romero.
Thank you, Madam President, and thank you all so much for being here. I have just 2 quick things. As has been mentioned, colleagues, I did have my staff in Paris share with everybody the additional information that the coalition is asking be printed. It's a 1-pager, so it shouldn't be that much of a cost difference. Also happy to know what that cost difference would be. And I know that this body would be in support of making sure that we allocate those funds so that we are able to have better notices. So I wanted to share that with colleagues. And my one question is still around the amount of time Detroiters have to appeal. Because on one end, we hear that it's not enough time. On the other end, we hear that it is enough time. Professor, if you wouldn't mind just sharing again why you and the coalition believe that we do not receive enough time. And a second question to that question is, what would it look like if we did make it optional for the assessment review? What would that look like in action?
Thank you so much for that question, Councilwoman Santiago Romero. So by Detroit ordinance, because Detroiters have to go to the assessor's review. If you don't go to the assessor's review, you can't get to the March Board of Review, you can't get to the Michigan Tax Tribunal. So if you want to file an appeal in Detroit, you have to do it by ordinance between February 1st and February 15th. So you have until February 15th. By, that deadline has been extended, but by ordinance, it has to be February 15th. I believe in the years they've extended it to 21st, et cetera, but it has to be by February 15th, okay? Every other homeowner in Michigan, when they file their appeal, they get until the first Monday in March, again, with the exception of Grand Rapids. That means that Detroit homeowners have less time than the majority of other homeowners in the state of Michigan to file an appeal. It's a really simple point. I'm not sure, so it's a really simple point. Now, if you heard Alvin Horn's kind of configuration, his configuration would be true if the assessor's review were optional. If the assessor's review were optional, then Detroiters would have exactly the same amount of time as every homeowner in Michigan, because they wouldn't have to do it by the 15th. They could do it by the 15th, but they would have to do it the first Monday in March, like every other homeowner in Michigan. So that's why we're coming before you asking for the assessor's review to be optional, to put Detroit homeowners on the same footing as the majority of all other homeowners in the state of Michigan. So thank you for that question.
Thank you. And I guess, not sure if you would know, or if Mr. Horn would know, what would it look like if it was optional? If the assessor review it were optional?
To the president, member, I don't think anyone knows.
Mm.
Mr. Donald alluded to almost 10,000 appeals this year. The March board, the assessor's review is under the control of the state of Detroit. In fact, right now, the assessor's review for the last 3 years has been through February 22nd, because this body mandated, because the mayor insisted, it's been through February 1st to the 22nd. The city of Detroit can do that with the assessor's review. It can't do that with the March board review. It starts, it ends, and it will end on that date. If the board review does not finish by that date, the state tax commission will order the county equalization director to finish it. And we may not like the results, but we will certainly pay for it, because Wayne County will simply hand us an invoice. And if we don't pay it, they'll simply take it out of revolving fund. So you lose control by eliminating the assessor's review. You are forcing the board review, which is all, and I have nothing but the highest regard and respect for the members of the board review, but they have a hard time finishing now. You're going to push another 2, 3, 4, 5,000 appeals that they have to see, that they have to hear. Mr. Down was already made it clear to you. What we can do informally at the assessor's review becomes a formal hearing at the March board review. They don't have an option. That's simply how it has to happen. There are other statutory obligations of the board review that have to be completed before the close of March. What that means is that everything else will be pushed back to July. The HOPE applications, the NEZ adjustments, every other adjustment that can be pushed back to another board review will be pushed back to another board review. Right now, the city of Detroit is still trying to get its tax roll adjusted from the adjustments that occurred this year. Push 5,000 more adjustments to more review. We won't be finished until November or December. As Madam President pointed out earlier, this forum is a great idea. And I thank you, Madam President, for bringing everyone together. I think it's important for the Detroiters to hear. I think it's important for this honorable body to hear what's really happening. Why do we have such a difference of opinion? What's the truth? Is it somewhere in the middle? Is it this end? Is it that end? And this is how we get there. What sounds like a good idea on paper may not be such a good idea when it comes to a practical application. It's the law of unexpected consequences. I think this sounds good until I actually have to put into practice. And then it's, what did I do? So that has to be considered now. I don't think anyone knows in fact, I know for a fact, no one knows what the board review will look like if you eliminate the assessor's review. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam President, through you to either you, Mr. Horner, Mr. Donwell. Given that Detroit and Grand Rapids are the only folks that have this review, what does it look like for other municipalities and other cities? Does it just go directly to an appeal as well, or what does their process looks like? And I'm no expert in this, so I would like to know a little bit more on what their process looks like. And I'm assuming because they are smaller, they don't have as much that we see. So if that might be a part of it, understood, but wondering if there's something else that I'm missing.
So through the chair to Councilor Santiago Ramirez, Detroit is the largest municipality in the state of Michigan. We do at a minimum 10 times more than anybody else in the state. Every other municipality actually calls us to ask us suggestions on how to handle certain years or how to address the appeals that they have coming because of the amount of work that we do. We schedule late days, we schedule weekends, we make ourselves accessible. But the reality of it is the numbers that we see is just far greater than any other municipality. The other point I just want to clear up Professor, so the filing date you have is a little off. they have to file by the second Monday in March. So that also reduces the amount of time that the board would have to hear those appeals. They have until the second Monday in March to file, there's a deadline for them to file an appeal. The meeting or organizational meeting for the March board is the Tuesday following the first Monday in March. This year, it is going to be March the 8th. So that means that they will have until March the 14th to file an appeal if there was no assessor review. And again, the March board ends on the 26th. So they, in essence, would have 12 days for the board of review to effectively manage whatever is filed by that, based upon that deadline.
Professor.
I just want to bring up two quick points for council. Number one, so what I want to bring up the data. So what did the data say about what actually happens in the assessor's review? What actually happens in the assessor's review is less than 10% of the people who file an appeal get a reduction. Currently is what our data shows us in terms of at the assessor's review, less than 10% get a reduction. But when they go to the March board of review, that number increases dramatically. So the reduction, when people actually go, the reductions aren't happening at the, right? Look, Mr. Donald's shaking his head. I'm not talking crazy here, right? So what's actually happening, council, city council? I want you all to understand that it's a battle of attrition, right? So what we're saying here, all of this talk about, again, it just worries me a little bit of these scare tactics. We won't be able to finish our work. But what's actually happening here is people file at the assessor's review and they get tired and they don't file at the March board of review, or some of them don't even know they can go on to the next step to file at the March board of review. And that's why the workload is less at the March board of review. So it seems to me the work that council should be doing is to, again, make the appeals process more accessible rather than trying to make it such that the city gets less appeals because of this fear that they won't be able to handle the appeals they get. It is every Detroit homeowner's right to file an appeal. So it behooves the city to get the structures together so that they can have their right to appeal. I would like to bring up one last thing, which is super important. And again, the coalition is about problem solving. So we went out and found a company called Matterhorn that works in lots of different cities on doing automating things. And so Matterhorn agreed to work with the city of Detroit, and then Quicken, what are they now called? Something else, not Quicken, but Rocket, then agreed to pay for this. So we have a situation, this was 3 years ago. Mr. Donald can tell us what is taking so long to implement this, because we have the technology, we have the committed funds to pay for the technology, and implementing this technology would make everything so much more efficient. Right now, there is so much inefficiency in the board of review. So instead of trying to hang on to this assessor's review and make it mandatory, why don't we make it optional? Give Detroiters the same amount of time to appeal as every other homeowner in Michigan, and make the March board of review more efficient through this technology that has already committed funds. It's to me, it's a no-brainer. I mean, it's real, like sometimes there are super complicated policy problems. This is not one of them.
If I may, Madam President.
Two hands, Mr. Horn, followed by Mr. Donald.
It's insulting to suggest that the staff in the assessor's office somehow is pressuring people not to pursue an appeal.
No, I wasn't saying that.
That's exactly what you said, Professor.
Make sure your cell phones are off, everyone.
The assessor's review is an informal process.
What's happening?
The assessor's review is an informal process. It's as simple as an email or coming to the office. We resolve most of those issues to the satisfaction of the taxpayer. They walk away satisfied. Simply because a formal appeal wasn't filed doesn't mean that somehow we pressured him or we made him go away. We fixed the problem. We make it easy for you to get your problem resolved. You send an email, you pick up the phone, you come to the office. You can't do that at the March board review. You sit down with a staff member, you tell them, hey, this doesn't look right. We go and look, and if we agree, we change it. We still control the assessment role during the assessor's review. If I make a change to the assessment role, it's going to go that way to the March board review. It won't show us a correction because I made the change while I still had authority over that road to make the change. So that's not even misleading. That's unfair to suggest that somehow we're not looking out for the best interests of taxpayers during the assessor's review. The assessor's review, and I can't say this, I can't emphasize this more. It is as informal as it can be. We make it as easy for property owners as we possibly can. The fact that suggests that somehow there's a better chance at the March board review to get a reduction, I hope you're not suggesting the board review is not following state law, because they have to follow the same law that the assessor does. There's no different law at the assessor's review for the assessor and a different one for the March board review during the March board review. The same law that I follow, Willie Downwell and his colleagues have to follow.
Thank you. Mr. Downwell.
I think that it's important, again, to just understand time frame and process. I'm just, again, just giving you the facts of the deadline of the filing and the time that's left. I've also am supporting if the assessor review is optional. That doesn't bother me one way or the other. Here's what we need to be able to do. There needs to be a policy in place that allows for that additional time on the front end so that property owners are able to do something before March. And several years ago, it was the whole purpose or impetus behind creating the multiple appeal spreadsheet. I was sitting in here 12 and 14 inches of snow outside and looking at individual appeals in the thousands. And it's not because I wanted to, it's the responsibility. It doesn't matter how many appeals that we get. We have to look at them individually. We can't blanketly look at a territory and say, we're going to assess it this way, and in the board of review, give a decision. And so there had to be a process put in place to do that. And I'm saying the same thing here. I'm saying that let's find a way for the assessor review to still be a part of the process that works for everybody. Because I don't want to be coming back to you next year talking about why something happened. Because the one thing that you will definitely understand, or you already know about me, if I tell you what's going to happen, it happens. Every single time that I have talked about or presented something to city council and said there was a problem and it was ignored, that problem came back to bite them. So I just want you to understand that from where I sit is from knowledge and experience. So please take that into account.
All right. Thank you so much, Mr. Downwell. Member.
Thank you, Madam President, and thank you all for that. That was very, very helpful. I definitely want to find ways for us to find a happy medium, because I would like to give Detroiters as much time as possible to appeal. I very much appreciate your policy suggestion. So I believe that we will definitely talk about that to see what that looks like and what we can implement. I guess just final comments is this MetaHorn technology, would love to know when it's going to be implemented. Mr. Horn.
Yes, so just real quickly, it's actually in development right now.
Okay.
Through the council president. It was just approved by city council earlier this year. It was held up in procurement. It was just a lot of things prior to. It finally got to city council, and city council approved it this year. We've been meeting with the company and where we are right now, there is a scheduled rollout by the first of the year.
Praise God. That's good.
Madam President.
Yes, the floor is yours. Go ahead.
Last comment. Thank you. That sounds great. I do remember seeing this when we approved it. So it's good to know that it's going to be implemented soon. A last comment regarding the board of review. In conversations, we've heard that the city has the same amount of board of review members as every other city in the states. So just a note for us as we work together with our folks at the state to see what it would take to have a bigger board, since we are a larger city that does see more amount of work. To me, it just makes sense. Not sure what thoughts are there.
I can answer that question with changing the law.
Yep.
It only allows for 9 members and two alternates,
Yep.
and the 2 alternates can only be in place when a board member is not working.
Yep. So Madam President, something that we should look into. Thank you.
Thank you for raising it. Thank you. President Pro Tem Tate, anything?
I mean, it was kind of certainly like to get a little bit more information when we start talking about the review that the assessor's review. I know it was mentioned that there's about 6,000 folks who go through the assessor's review. And it was also mentioned that only about 10% of them get that reduction in their taxes. So I would like to see a little bit more about that, especially seeing that sounds like that's a point of contention. And when we start talking about timelines as well as effectiveness. So I may not get that done today because I want to actually look at stuff in front of me. I want to go through it and ask questions about it. But maybe there's a brief statement that folks want to have now, but that one is piquing my interest a lot more than some of the other stuff that I've heard.
Through the President Pro Tem, I'll just sum it up in a few words. A lot of the work that's done during the assessor review, the board review gets credit for, because that information is passed on through the board review for those changes to be done, to be implemented.
Yeah. So I appreciate that, but again, we want to see some numbers because I'm sure you benefit from it. I'm absolutely sure, but it's just a matter of what does that look like?
Yep.
And just like when we start talking about these documents, and Dr. Tuane will tell you, my question is, what does it look like? We can talk about it, but what does it look like? So I would like to see actual numbers. And Mr. Horn, how challenging would that be? Do you all track that information? How many? It sounds like if we got a 10% number coming from Dr. Tuane, that maybe you do track that.
Through the chair, yes, sir, we do track it. We track the number of appeals that are filed in the assessor's review, the number that are successfully resolved, the reason for the resolution, and then how many property owners elect to protect their rights and pursue an appeal to the March board review. So we do track those numbers, yes, sir.
Okay, so that'll be part of our questions that we'll be sending, looking to get responses to.
Yes, sir.
Thank you, Madam President.
Thank you, President Pro Tem.
Can I
Dr.
just
Tuane.
respond? So, Pro Tem Tate, this is a council member, show me the data council member, that's what we call him. And so I love it. You just gave me a research project and I will, within the next 3 weeks, I will get you these numbers. All I need from dear Sir Alvin Horn is the data. And I will put together with joy a report. And that report's gonna tell you, number one, how many appeals are filed at the assessor's review, what the decision was, meaning how much of a reduction or, what actually happened, how many then went on to the March Board of Review, and then what was the decision there in terms of reduction in both assessed value and taxable value. So as soon as I get the data from Alvin Horn, I will happily produce that report for you because, I'm all about data and that way you can see it all for yourself. And I will only deal with data that I'm given from Alvin Horn. So yeah, I will do that with alacrity. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Pro Tem. Yes, Member Durham.
Thank you, Madam President. Good afternoon, everyone. I have a question. I know we talked about optional assessors review. When we talk about best practices, is that practice anywhere around the country? Just curious for a city the size of the city of Detroit.
Through the chair, I can't think of one, and I've been in communication with over the years a number of municipalities in terms of what they've done and looking at data. Kansas City, because they're suffering from a similar issue in terms of what may be happening with Black Americans who own properties and foreclosure process. Same thing in St. Louis, and so, but none of the other municipalities that I've talked to have a similar optional process.
Through the chair, sir, different states have different laws. Michigan is somewhat unique in allowing a jurisdiction to have an option in addition to the March Board review. Chicago has adopted a different approach. Philadelphia has adopted a different approach. So different cities have approaches based on their law. Detroit's approach is based on Michigan law. In many ways, laws are similar, but in many ways they're different. And when it comes to appealing valuation, there's a lot of differences between the states.
Can I answer that one too? So this is what I study. And so Michigan law actually, as we said earlier, doesn't provide for an assessor's review. in the Michigan law, the Michigan Tax Act, the General Tax Act does not provide for an assessor's review. The assessor's review only exists here in Detroit as an anomaly, and it was created through ordinance, through that provision that we talked about in the presentation earlier. So Detroit and Grand Rapids are an anomaly in Michigan. Again, the General Tax Act does not allow for assessor's review, but they do allow localities to do it by ordinance. So it's not normal. It's not a best practice in Michigan. It's not normal in Michigan. But there's a second one. So what do other jurisdictions do? The closest jurisdiction that I can bring that I think would be helpful is Milwaukee, right? Another kind of majority Black city here in the Midwest. And what Milwaukee does is they have something called an open book period before their board of review. And it's essentially an optional assessor's review where citizens very informally can walk in. I just had a meeting with the Milwaukee assessor yesterday because this is what I'm working on. And they can walk in and deal with things like Mr. Horn is saying, just incorrect little inaccuracies. They can come in. You don't need a formal assessor's review period to do that. They just call it an open book. People, fix things up, bring things to the assessor's attention, and then the official process begins. So what we're suggesting, that's precisely why we made the suggestion of the optional assessor's review, is based on the Milwaukee experience. But I do want to make it super clear that Michigan law does not, the state law does not allow for the assessor's review. That is done by Detroit City Ordinance. Thank you.
If I may, Madam President,
Yes,
Michigan law actually allows this. Any city in the state, because Michigan law allows it, they allow every jurisdiction, as long as they have a March board review, they can add something in front of that March board
That's
review.
right.
They can't do anything
That's
to.
exactly right.
So
That's what I just said. Yes.
no, that's not quite what you just said, Professor.
Yeah.
You seem to imply that Detroit is the norm, is the exception to the rule.
Yes, so there's only two places in Michigan, right? It's Detroit and then Grand Rapids. But I'm saying the way in which Detroit enacted is not enacted through the through state law. It's enacted, state law allows you to pass a local ordinance to put it into effect. In Detroit, it's in effect through Detroit's local ordinance is what I'm saying.
The two largest cities in the state have an assessor's review for a reason. Detroit is 6 times the size of Grand Rapids. Grand Rapids is 3 times the size of the next largest jurisdiction in the state. That's why they have assessor's review. And keep in mind, it's an apple to orange comparison. Grand Rapids had less than 200 appeals last year. I spoke to Paula Jesper, the assessor for Grand Rapids. They average about 112 a year since she's been the assessor. It is an apple to orange comparison to look at any other jurisdiction and say, they do that, why is Detroit doing it? Detroit's doing it because we have 10,000 appeals a year. That's why Detroit does it.
Member Durham.
Thank you. A follow-up question, Madam President. So when we talk about even extending the period, obviously, we also had to talk about staffing. If we talk about shortages. So I'd be just interested just to know, maybe off the top of your head, maybe this is further discussion of what that would take relative to staffing. And then obviously that has a fiscal impact on our budget as well. And so one of the things, even when we've had these conversations relative to overassessment or property tax reform, which in a lot of cases I'm very supportive of, but I still want to know what the fiscal impact will be on our budget. I think that's something that needs to be discussed, and we don't want to just put a Band-Aid on this problem. I think multiple folks are here right now to discuss this because we want to ensure what has happened doesn't happen again. And I think we're all in agreement of that. But I think it's good to know that fiscal impact as well. And I know we haven't sent this to the law department yet, but I think a fiscal study, fiscal analysis would be very important relative to any changes in the ordinance. And then also coming from your office, for us to know what that may take relative to staffing, additional staffing being added or whatnot. Thank you, Madam President.
Thank you, Member Durham. All right, is there any questions or additional comments from my colleagues? If not, we can move. Mr. Whitaker, did you have anything? Okay. All right, we will
Madam
move.
President.
Oh, yes, Mr. Corley.
Thank you so much, Madam President. This is one quick question. So, and great work by the coalition, and I always appreciate the work from assessors and Mr. Donwell. There was a discussion about higher value homes being taxed at a lower rate. And I'm wondering, is that partially due and maybe largely due to the fact that many higher value homes receive a form of a tax abatement. It could be a new NEZ if it's the new construction, or it can be a home NEZ, homestead in NEZ if it's an existing structure. And if that is the case, then that could speak to the inequities that we're seeing when it comes to tax abatements with residential property. So just want to put that out there, and whoever's willing to respond to that, I would greatly appreciate it.
Thank you. Does anyone want to respond, or who would like to respond?
Well, through the chair, my response is there's no systemic problem with the assessment roll. I reject the notion that we are undervaluing that we're overvaluing low value properties and that we're undervaluing high value properties. That's my response.
All right, Mr. Donwell.
I'm simply going to make a suggestion to City Council through the chair. You know, the question was brought up at the very beginning as it relates to a sales ratio study. You know, I don't know if a sales ratio study is the right term in terms of what needs to be done. But I do believe that a sense of modeling probably should be suggested in the process. And here's why I say that. The overassessment process that we're talking or the conversation is about is a snapshot in time. It's truly a snapshot in time. And you're really going to have to somewhat get into the weeds. The assessment process is somewhat exact and at the same time somewhat subjective. And what I mean by that is you have properties in the city of Detroit that may fall outside of the general parameters of what may be in the usual concept in the assessor's manual. So you may need to look at things in a larger scale, but still follow the guides of the assessment process. And at the same time, you're going to have to physically, you're not going to be able to do this sitting at a desk. You're going to have to physically view some of these sites. One of the problems, and it's worked into being an assessor, geographic competence. Geographic competence. You're supposed to know your market, understand your market. The key thing that most assessors have to follow in the practice is the law. And the key rule that's used is, what is the usual selling price? So if a property is 100 years old and the usual selling price is $20,000, then depreciation adjustments and everything needs to be applied to create the assessed value. But again, what does that look like for Detroit and the different neighborhoods that makes up Detroit? So, and I'm being careful and clear in how I'm saying this, because whatever is done cannot go outside of the guides of the direction that is given by the State Tax Commission. Because when you do that, you're opening up yourself for a problem.
If I may, Madam President.
Mr. Horn.
I think sometimes, I think we need to keep in mind, we're talking about mass appraisal. We're not talking about an individual sales price. In mass appraisal, you don't take that household for $100,000, so it's worth $100,000. You take the price of similar houses in similar neighborhoods, and you compute literally it's an average. So your house might sell for $100,000, your house might sell for $80,000, your house might sell for $75,000. You look for any possible differences, whether it's the condition of the property, the condition of the neighborhood, the age of the property. And then you come up with a median. You come up with an average assessed value. So it's not as straightforward as follow that sale. That's the market value. That's the assessed value. That's an appraisal. That's an individual appraisal. You hire an appraiser to come to your house, tell you what your house is worth. That's not assessments. That's not what an assessor does. Is mass appraisal. I think the nuances sometimes get lost because it's not as straightforward as that's what that house sold for. That's what it's worth. It's what similar houses in similar conditions, in similar locations, over a similar time period sell for. And it's not always as straightforward as it might appear. Thank you, Madam President.
All right, thank you. And Bernadette, closing.
This is the last thing I'll say is that, at this point, we have reams of data. We have studies from professors at University of Virginia, Duke, UC San Diego, University of Chicago, all saying the same thing, that there is systematic overassessment of the lowest valued homes. But and this is I'm glad that this is happening in this session, where you see Alvin Horn continually saying, I reject that there's any problem. Guess what? You cannot fix a problem until you acknowledge it exists. And so this is the beauty of the reform that we're putting forth, where council doesn't have, the 3-member advisory board will do for you an independent advisory board that you all nominate, can run these, because these numbers are difficult. And everything he just said was correct about appraisals, doing property taxes is different than appraisal. Everything he said is correct. So you'll have 3 experts that you nominate to run the number and do your own assessment ratio study for you all to see what's going on. Because right now, no matter how many times different entities, whether it's Rashida Tlaib or council president, has asked the Alvin Horn and this current administration to do this assessment ratio study, they're refusing to do it. But we have about 4 different ones done by 4 different entities. We have even had those studies peer reviewed. I just don't see, there is nowhere else to go in terms of, the data are clear. There are some things that are kind of on the fence when it comes to numbers. This is just not one of them. So I just want to say that, again, we have to suture the wound. We have to stop these overassessments in Detroit so we can move on to conversations about compensation. We cannot suture the wound if the administration is denying in the face of all of this data that a problem even exists. So we can't move forward. And so we do need this, again, you all to have your own independent experts, since the administration is refusing to do this assessment ratio study. That's all I have to say. Thank you so much for your time and attention to everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.
I have one last thing
All right,
to say,
Mr.
ma'am.
Horn, and then I want to move to, I see Member Calloway does. Member Calloway, did you want to respond first?
Yeah, just real quickly. Thank you, Madam
Yes.
Chair. I reject what you are saying, Mr. Horn, that there's not a problem, that there's not been an overassessment of properties, and that problem no longer exists. It does exist. I go into the community every single day, and I hear from constituents and residents that they're being overassessed in different parts of my district, particularly in 48238 and 48203. So I reject what you're saying, Mr. Horn, and I do agree with the professor that we should have our own independent study, and I don't necessarily believe we have to wait on the administration to approve a study. We can approve our own study. We can move forward independent of the administration. I believe that's the page that we're on, and I see Madam President shaking her head in agreement. So we are going to move forward. I do believe that. And so thank you to all 3 of you, but I reject what you're saying, Mr. Horn. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you.
If I may.
Yes.
There is no systemic, and I've said this, I've been very clear about this. There's no systemic problem in the city, but there's 400,000 parcels in the city. And I start off by saying that I wouldn't dare tell anyone that every single one of them is valued correctly. I also point this out, and the coalition said this at the very beginning of the presentation. They brought 250 appeals over the last 3 years, 250 appeals over a 3-year period in the city with 409,000 plus parcels. That is not indicative of a problem. They've taken dozens of appeals to the Michigan Tax Tribunal over a 3-year period in a city of over 409,000 parcels. That is a fact. And that is not indicative of a massive problem or a systemic problem.
All right, thank you so much, Mr. Horn. All right, Member Young, and then I want to go to our public comment. We do have a couple callers online and in person.
Yes, thank you so much, Madam President. Mr. Horn, first you said, how many appeals does the city of Detroit have a year?
The city of Detroit itself, how many appeals were filed at the assessor's review?
Yeah.
I don't have the exact number, but I believe at the assessor's review it was just shy of 10,000 people. But those are appeals of all type, corrections to assessment role, valuation appeals, adjustment. So they're 10,000 of all types.
Okay, and then my second question is, because you're saying there's no problem with it structurally. So are you saying that this is a cyclical problem? Are you saying that the way in which we got here in the first place was after the Great Recession? Because you had the property values that fell at such a precipitous rate that the tax rate did not reflect or did not match what the property values fell. And so at the time you had the money to be able to come up with this citywide assessment, you are correcting that problem cyclically? Is that what you're saying? I just want to understand, there's no serious problem. How did we get to where we got in the first place if it's not structural? It's just something that's cyclical that we're fixing now?
Well, through the president, we got here because, to be honest, the assessor's office, I don't want to use the word incompetent, but they were starved of resources at the worst possible time as property values were rapidly decreasing, as the city was in the middle of a recession, just like the state was. What happened in the assessor's office was reflective of city services across the board. Streetlights didn't work, garbage was iffy, the police cars were falling apart, there weren't enough fire trucks and for emergency responders. Everything, every service in this city fell apart, and the assessor's office was part of that. They simply did not have the resources to do the job that was in front of them. And it got so bad that the state intervened, and they a corrective action plan, which is a fancy word of saying an order to fix your stuff. They ordered the county equalization director to literally become the assessor of the city until we got it right. We were able to get control of our assessment role 2 years early because the administration took it seriously. It became a priority, along with this honorable body. It became a priority to get it right and get it fixed, and we were able to demonstrate what the work we've been doing. I thank the professor for kind words earlier. The progress that's been made over the last several years has been, to some extent, fixing the huge mistake of the past. It took us decades to get there. It's taken us a few years to get to fix it. I keep using this term, there's no systemic problem, but I'm not going to say there's not a problem. Once again, there's over 400,000 parcels in the city. I'm not going to pretend that every single one of them is assessed correctly. If I were to tell you that 95% of the assessment roll is correct, that sounds great. That means there's possibly 20,000 issues. I don't pretend that there aren't individual problems, but that's what the appeals period is for. And that's also why we need to be as transparent as we can and address concerns as soon as they happen. And we've done a very good job there over the last 5 to 6 years. But to your question, Councilperson Callaway, I would not dare, my apologies, I would not dare suggest in this city that there aren't homes in this property that the values aren't correct. It's a statistical impossibility for any. If I had 3 times the staff that the assessor's office currently have, there would still be problems with homes in the city. That's why we have an appeals period, and that's why we have staff who will go and look whenever the issue comes up. Thank you, Madam President.
Thank you.
Thank you, member, you were done. Okay. All right, we had one more community member comments, and that's by Thomas Lewis, and he will have 2 minutes. He did call in advance, so we can promote Mr. Lewis. And then everyone else for general public comment will have 1 minute.
Okay, thank you very much, Madam President. Thank you, City Council. I want to first of all emphasize why I believe it's so important to pass this ordinance. Just like most people born and raised in Detroit, I was born in the 60s, but I was raised by parents in the 70s. And we had families who wanted to leave legacy homes for all of us. Like most people, I wanted to leave a legacy home for my children. I live in a house in which I have been paying property taxes for over 30 years. And I ran into a situation in which I was only able to earn half of my income. So at least 2 or 3 of my tax years was turned over to the county. And I was in a payment plan. The plan was horrendous. I was paying approximately $170 just for 1 tax year every month, knowing that penalties and interest were continuing over that period of time. Anyway, I was introduced to a program called the URSPA program through the coalition. And through that program, I went back to the county. They told me, go back to the county and tell them about the URSPA program. They were able to consolidate all of those prior taxes under one payment plan. And that payment plan went from $179 a month to $79 a month. And it allowed me to catch up. The reason I'm telling you this is just like other people, I could have lost my home too. It's very easy to get in that slippery slope. I'm not one of these people that took out extra things on my house. I don't have a second mortgage, but just like everyone else, I need a lot of work done on my home. I'm so sorry that people who have lost their homes have had to endure some of the indignities that we've had to endure. I thank you for your time. And one last thing, the Detroit News indicated that I
Uh-oh. All right, Mr. Thomas got muted. We can allow him to finish his last sentence. He did call in advance. Can you unmute him? Go right ahead, Mr. Thomas. Finish
okay,
your sentence.
thank you. According to the Detroit News, by a very conservative estimate, I have overpaid the city of Detroit $5,550. Thank you very much. I appreciate your time.
Appreciate your time as well, Mr. Thomas. Thank you so much. We will now turn for general public comments. Do we have anyone here in the committee of a whole that would like to speak? Please join us here at the seats, open seats. All right, if you could just state your name and everyone will have 1 minute for public comment.
All right. Thank you so much, City Council, for holding this space today. My name is Joanna Velasquez. I'm the campaign manager with Detroit Action and happily here with the Coalition for Property Tax Justice. I'm here today in support of the ordinance because at my age of 27, I've moved 15 times. And that type of displacement is continuing to be placed on Detroiters today, and we do not deserve that. And so it's really hard for me to sit in this space and hear some of the hesitancy, some of the resistance, some of the denial of what has been happening for a decade now at this point. And it's shameful. And this ordinance is the ordinance that will create the structural change that our folks need to see to make sure, again, we're searching the room. So I ask for City Council support today. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Yolanda Jackson. I am the Public Policy Manager at Community Development Advocates of Detroit. I'm here to just urge you all to do everything in your power, exercise all the resources that are available to ensure that there is some property tax reform in the city of Detroit. I think that Professor Bernadette said it quite simply, that the data is simple. When I was looking at Mr. Langowski's presentation of the blue neighborhood that was being underassessed, I knew exactly what neighborhood that was. Grand River and Southfield, Grandmont Rosedale, beautiful neighborhood, place I would like to live. And then he showed the homes being underassessed in Plymouth and Greenfield. And I think that that points directly to the fact that this is systemic. To say that it's not systemic is to say that we don't live in America, as we know that racist policies, racist housing policies have plagued the United States since its inception. And I don't think that Detroit is the exception here. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Yolanda.
Antoine Jackson, Executive Director of MAC Development. I want to begin by saying thank you for this gathering today and bringing this to the forefront. I just want to add one piece of information. It seemed to be swiped at the number of appeals that the coalition was able to bring forth, at 250. One of the reasons that I know of, because we were on the ground at MAC Development making calls to residents trying to get them to once again take some action, many of them feel re-victimized over and over again. Their dignity has been stolen, lost, taken, whatever you want to call it. And so many of them did not want to even step up to try again, even though we explained to them the process, even though we explained to them that we were there to truly advocate and be a support for them. What I would encourage and really strongly hope is that each of the city council members would take time to talk to your constituents so that you can hear directly how it is that they feel that they've been victimized repeatedly. And so whenever I heard Mr. Horn swipe at that 250 number, I really felt indignant, quite frankly, because I was on the phone talking to residents who said, I don't want to do this again. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you for you all for coming down and joining us today in person. We're going to turn now to our virtual public comments. And how many hands do we have raised?
Madam
hands.
President,
Okay.
we had 6 callers with their hands raised before you cut off public comment. The first caller is Tahira Ahmad.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much for doing this. Mr. Horn has his head in the sand. I've been down to the assessor's office every year. I'm over 60 years old, and these people have dismissed my claims, wouldn't even look at my pictures or even look at my evidence of how I've been overtaxed. And this is repeated every year. He's not he's being disingenuous. And I think he needs to resign along with Mike Duggan, because they know they're overtaxing us. I've been overtaxed $15,000 between the 2 properties that I have, and I demand my money back. I'm not waiting on you to do an assessment. I'm gonna find a way to get my money out of you somehow, some way. If we don't pay the illegal taxes, the county will tax us. Tax us even more. They'll put on interest. They'll put on penalties, and then we're unable to pay these illegal taxes.
All right, thank you so much.
The next caller is Brenda Butler.
Good evening.
Good evening.
I have been working with the coalition in the community with our neighbors, and they are doing a wonderful job. And I agree with Greg that I was very upset that Mr. Horn kept saying that the coalition had only spoken with or reported on 450 people or 250 people, but then he comes to a meeting this important. He knew that these were some of the answers that we would want, and he tells us now on this call that he has to get that information back to us. That is disingenuous. So I ask that the city council please support the community and the coalition and the homeowners in this city. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Madam President, the next caller is Luella Pizzuti.
Hi there. Thank you very much. I live in Brightmoor in one of those over-assessed, low-value homes. You'll be seeing me in February, but I haven't had a chance to address that because I've knocked on over 500 doors to keep my neighbors from losing their houses. It's been a matter of priorities, not a matter of damages. When you come to the cost of these problems, I have to tell you, we're already paying the cost of not enacting these remedies. We see it with long-term Detroiters losing legacy homes. We see it with neighborhoods polka dotted or decimated by blight. Please, let's pay the cost up front to have vibrant neighborhoods with people in them instead of carcasses of homes. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you.
The next caller is Samsung SM.
Hi, thank you for this opportunity. I thank you for the work that council is putting forward. Is there possible to use some interns to even do a deeper dive into who's actually been hardest hit? And I'm looking at and thinking about our senior citizens and the areas, especially in the Virginia Park area. I know me personally have been overtaxed. Fortunately, I've been able to keep up with it, but I would like some conversation back from the overtaxation, not only on a structure, but also on property that we purchased before, land property that we purchased before the side lots came into existence, that program. So what can we do outside of just the governmental officials? Can we look at using some of Wayne State students or some type of internship just to do a deeper dive and looking at remedies? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Virginia Park.
Madam President, the next caller ends in 534. If you can unmute.
Yes, hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, I'm sorry, I couldn't hear you. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Good evening. We can hear you.
Okay, thank you. Well, I wanted to say that for minutes, I was giving Mr. Corley a standing ovation, and I give that to the people putting on this hearing, and I'm saying for Mr. Corley bringing up the neighborhood enterprise zone taxing schemes. And I would love to see overlay maps of foreclosures and where there are the concerns of the overtaxations. And when I first learned what an NAZ was, I said, man, that sounds great, and it may have made sense at a certain time, but it sure really seems unfair right now. Also, please urge the state legislature to revisit the foreclosure period, because it was in 1999, my understanding, they shortened it from 5 years to 2. That's less time to figure it out. And of course, too much money was diverted to demolitions instead of keeping people in their homes.
All right. Thank you, Ms. Warwick.
Madam President, that was the last caller before you cut off public comment.
All right. Thank you so much. That will conclude our public comment. And I just want to thank everyone for taking the time this evening to be a part of the discussion. Thank you, Professor, and to the entire coalition. I know this was a collaborative effort to educate our community on property tax reform. Mr. Horn, you have answered every call and made sure that you are present, even if we didn't agree. And so I am just very hopeful that we will have some type of reform that will benefit the residents of Detroit. And Mr. Downwell, you know you are known citywide for the work that you do, and you're always available. And I'm just glad that we all were able to come together. To all of my colleagues, Member Dorhall, Member Johnson, Member Santiago Ramiro, Member Young, Member Waters, Member Callaway, President Pro Tem Tate, Member Benson, we are all united as one on this issue of property tax reform and making sure that we keep Detroiters in their homes and address this issue. And so I thank each and every one of you all for attending. To the residents of Detroit, we appreciate you all for tuning in as well. This will be available online to view it for those who were not able to attend or would like to go back and review this information. We will also make sure all the PowerPoints are available to the general public to review as well too. And looking forward to some type of ordinance that will be forthcoming at some point, hopefully before the end of this year. So thank you. And to all of the grassroots organizations that were here, we appreciate the work that you all do as well on behalf of the residents of Detroit.
If I may, Madam President, I'd like to
Yes.
thank you for the work you've done.
Thank
This
you.
has been a passion of yours for at least the last 2 terms.
Thank you.
Whatever gets done, all credit belongs to you. So even though we don't always agree on some of the
I appreciate that.
solutions, I have nothing but the highest regard and respect for you.
Likewise, Mr. Horn, I appreciate it. All right, with that being said, if there's nothing else to come before us, again, thank you, everyone. Have a great evening, and this meeting will now stand adjourned.